When Rads asked me to step in at this point, she said, "What passage will you preach from?" And this was weeks and weeks ago, and I was like, I don't know, choose the gospel for this week and we'll figure it out when we get there. And then last week I had one of those experiences where I'm like, right, so many times God's out ahead of us in ways we just never quite realize until we get there, until we experience it. Because I found myself last week, annually I go away with a bunch of people. We go away for a weekend together. And I didn't grow up in the church, but I first came to church when I was about 19, 20. And there was a bunch of people my age, and I'm now in my mid-40s, and we're still friends. And life has taken us in different directions. But every year we get together. One member of the group, kind of approaching late July every year, looks up Groupon and says, there's some kind of discount in some hotel somewhere. We're all going to go stay there, and we all quickly jump on and buy a voucher and all then go and have dinner together and then stay the night at the hotel. And the next morning we get up, have breakfast and go for a big walk somewhere. And all of those things, the dinner, the breakfast, the walk, they're all really chances just to catch up and talk and mix up and almost continue a conversation from last year or the year before. And maybe it's something that many of you haven't experienced yet, but maybe it's a mid-40s or beyond kind of thing. But holy moly, how did a year go that quickly? And here we are again. Thank God we're here again, but man, a year went very, very quickly. And so we're catching up. And the year before, I had a conversation with one of my friends who'd lost his dad a few years ago and his mum a few months before. And he talked about what it was like as the youngest of three sons to be essentially in charge of dividing up the family inheritance. The other two brothers live in the country. His mum and dad lived here in the suburbs, and he lives in the suburbs. And so he was the local one, and he had to take charge of ensuring things were divided up evenly, because that was the will of his mum who died. Divided up evenly, so he did. And I asked him what that was like, and he said, well, most things you can't split in three. Makes sense, right? Divide things evenly. That's okay when it's a bank account, but stuff, it's hard to divide in three. So he said, I spent a lot of time ensuring that if I had to err on any side, it was err on making sure my brothers got a fairer share than I did. Because I'm here and I'm in charge, and the last thing I want is for there to be any relational damage done by splitting up of the family stuff. And I remember thinking, wow, I haven't had to face that, but my brother, I'm proud of you for the work that you've done and how hard that must be. And even making the choice, if I have to come out slightly less, I'll do that, because my relationship with my brothers is more important than whether it was absolutely fair or not. I'll make sure they get a little bit more. And I remember that conversation from last year, because the conversation this year was with another friend whose grandmother had just died in 96. When I was first ordained in ministry 20 years ago, a month into my ordination, her grandfather died, and she asked me to do the funeral. It was a privilege, of course, to step into that space. And then her grandmother, every time I'd seen her in the 20 years, she would remember and thank me for the work that I did on her husband's funeral. And then when she died earlier this year, I had asked that I do the funeral, so I took her funeral. And I asked my friend Sarah, I said, how's things going in the family? And she proceeded to tell me about the stress that had been manifest in the family because Grandma had decided to change her will relatively late. And Grandma had two kids, a son and a daughter, and Sarah's the granddaughter and of the daughter. So she's saying, my uncle got 75% in the will, and my mum got 25%. And I said, what's been happening? She said, well, my mum and her brother have been arguing. And I said, is it about the money? And she said, no, it's actually not about the money, it's about what the money means. Grandma's 96, came out from England a long time ago, kind of operates out of a different worldview, and that is that the money gets handed down to the eldest son. You know, the money gets maintained mostly in the male line. The daughter's married off. She's part of a different family now. It's their responsibility to look after her. She gets 25%. That old ownership crap from a long, long time ago, made manifest here in 2019 in a family going, oh, Grandma. You know, and to hear it being discussed in that family, and if you can go to the next slide, Luke, the next one even, thank you, that didn't quite work. To hear it discussed in the family, I had imagined that what they would be fighting about was the difference between 75% and 25% was a lot of money. But to hear Sarah talk about it was like, no, the thing we're most upset about is that our uncle doesn't get it. That it's not about the money, it's about relationship. It's about all of us. Because he's quite happy to keep his 75%. And when they say, shouldn't we share it? Because it's not really about us, it's for the future generations. He's like, no, this is what Mum wanted. I'm keeping the 75%. And Sarah was almost in tears at the idea that her uncle was so lost that he would prioritize that over the relationship in the family. Now, he was already particularly wealthy, the uncle. And Sarah kind of finished her remembering or recounting of this story by saying, how many Ferraris is enough for one person? That's not a question I've ever imagined asking of myself or anyone in my family. Still, it's amazing what money can do, particularly lots of it, to families and relationships, isn't it? An unnamed man comes up to Jesus. Hey, Jesus, settle an argument between me and my siblings. Make my brother share. Rabbis, as Jesus was, teachers, were often asked to kind of wade into family disputes. Help us figure out how to do this. And this was the presenting question. Help me get my fair share. Jesus was probably deeply aware of the way in which inheritance wasn't just about handing things on, but it's about protecting privilege and ensuring it stays maintained in certain places, certain classes, certain lines. And so when he's asked this question, he has a different response. Thanks, Luke. His first response being asked to weigh into a family dispute is to say, take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. All kinds of greed, be on guard against. All kinds of greed. Jesus resists the presenting question and tries to help the person asking find the better question, the deeper question, to be aware of what is really at stake rather than just make my brother be fair. Make sure I get enough. It's a good question, but there's something even deeper. So why, Jesus? Why are you wanting us and the disciples of the day to be really aware of this? In the reading that we heard from Colossians, there was a phrase. Greed is clearly when the people who put the lectionary together wanted us to focus on, because it appears in Colossians as well. Thanks, Luke. You might have heard that line, put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly, lists a few things, and then names greed, which is idolatry. That's a strange phrase, but Paul uses it elsewhere in his letter to the Ephesians. He says, be sure of this. He makes a similar list of people who won't participate in the kingdom, and he gets to, and one who is greedy, that is an idolater, won't have any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. And interesting, the word inheritance is in there too, given it starts with a question in the gospel reading about inheritance. So idolatry, before we go any further, how is greed idolatry? What is idolatry? This isn't meant to be a question you just let me answer. When I say idolatry, what is it? What comes to mind? I'm not looking for the correct answer, just give me the answers that, we'll find correct together, but I'm just saying this isn't a test. Worshipping an idol, okay? What else? Any other? Statues? Yep. Carved images? Yep. Yeah, putting something ahead of, above God in your priorities. It's pretty good. Any other ideas or understandings of what idolatry is about? Yeah, you can lift up something, someone, not just a statue, but someone, idolize. Yeah, great. This book that I've got the cover on the screen, Greed as Idolatry, by Brian Rosner. Brian's from Ridley College in Melbourne. He tries to explore why does Paul, because it's pretty much the only place this idea is explored, but Paul states it as if it's fact. Greed is idolatry. And what on earth does that mean? And he explores it a little bit in a few different ways. Thanks, Luke. These are the different chapters he has in the book. Maybe what Paul is meaning is greed is as bad as idolatry. Idolatry, bad. Greed, bad. Therefore, greed is idolatry. Maybe. It's really where he starts the argument. He moves beyond there. Maybe greed leads to idolatry. Maybe accumulating things beyond that which is the level at which we need leads to idolatry. Maybe greed is worshipping wealth. Instead of a carved statue, it's idolizing, it's putting wealth as that which we worship. Is greed slavery imposed by an economic system? Is greed service and obedience to wealth? You see him unpacking these different ways of wealth being prioritized, being made primary. Greed is inordinate love of and devotion to money. And greed is trust and confidence in wealth. These are the ways he unpacks what Paul might be trying to say in his letters to the Colossians and the Ephesians about being wary of this in the spirit of Jesus' warning to the disciples and to this man's question. Be very wary of the way in which greed can become all these things. An object of love and devotion, something we worship, something we're obedient to, in service of, something we have trust in and confidence in, wealth. You've heard the story. I'm sure you've heard the story. It's a bit of a, it's become almost an apocryphal story, but I understand it to be true. The story of J.D. Rockefeller, who at the beginning of last century, so over 100 years ago, was a billionaire at a time where the word billionaire, that's like saying a gazillionaire today. Like it's a billionaire over 100 years ago. That phrase is just like, you're not just rich, you're so incredibly, unbelievably. And my understanding is they've done some kind of maths to assess if his fortune then was equivalent to today, he's still by far the richest person on earth. Right, so the richest person on earth is asked by a journalist, but how much money is enough? Have you heard this story? Who knows the answer? His answer was just a little bit more. And I don't think he was being sarcastic. I don't think he was being snide. I think he was being as truthful as he could be in that moment, because even for the richest person in the history of the planet at that time, and possibly still today, is asked how much is enough, the answer is, well, whatever I have isn't there yet. So the answer must be just a little bit more. When you ask money to do that which it cannot do, which is to satisfy us and to make us feel whole and secure, the answer is, I'm not there yet. Now we all think, well, I'd like to have a try, right? Somebody's secretly thinking, I'll have a go at being the richest person on earth and seeing if I can be satisfied. All right, we'd all like to give it a go. Some of you are thinking, it's okay. But here is what Jesus is inviting us to be on guard about. We're asking potentially money to do that which it is incapable of doing. How much is enough? Is money capable of, in and of itself, ever providing us enough to feel secure, to feel whole, to feel safe? In the accumulation of stuff, as Jesus said, life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions. Jesus is saying, careful that you don't accidentally put stuff in place of that which only God can provide. For that is idolatry. putting anything that is not God in the place of God to do that which only God can do. And if that's the thing in which we place our confidence and our trust, whatever it is, money, possessions, good enough status, job, housing, Instagram followers, whatever it is that if I could just get there, everything's going to be okay. I'm going to feel safe. I'm going to feel whole. Whenever we do that for anything that is not God, we're asking of that thing that which it cannot do. And therefore we have fallen into the trap that all history of humanity has fallen into over and over again, of idolatry, of asking something to do that which only God can do. And indeed, idolatry is a major problem still in our world today. I don't know if I only saw the meme this afternoon and I didn't have time to add it into the PowerPoint slides for tonight, but have you seen there's a well, it's maybe less a meme, but as a scientist talking about how at the root of why we're having trouble tackling this climate change thing is because scientists can't actually solve the root problem, which is greed. All the information in the world about the problem that climate change is and will cause and will continue to cause isn't solving the problem. Information about what's happening isn't solving. Projecting forward both how we got there and where it's going isn't solving. The problem is an ethical, moral, spiritual problem of us wanting more and more and more, and more of the world wanting more and more and more, such that we are in the space that we're in. Scientists saying, we're going to need help. We can't solve this on our own. Idolatry, asking anything to replace what only God is capable of providing, is still, of course, a major problem for us. Thanks, Luke. Our friend Chad Myers, friend of the congregation, has a website where he's looking at all kinds of things, but in particular this passage, he's got some really wonderful phrases about this passage that we're looking at tonight. He says the deep memory of Sabbath economics, a different economic system, a different economic model, the deep memory of it is nowhere more clearly asserted than in this passage that we're looking at tonight. The first half, the farmer storing up treasures, is a meditation on the lethal power of greed, he says. Isn't that a great phrase? The lethal power of greed, in which Jesus denounces the artificial abundance of the rich and the artificial scarcity of the poor, using the object lesson of a farmer who just can't hoard enough. There isn't enough. The second half offers two positive object lessons from nature, the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, as indicative, says Ched, of the promise of divinely underwritten sufficiency. That's a beautiful phrase if we think about what it means in maybe more simple language. The language of the academy is occasionally just a little bit more complex than it needs to be, but yes, the promise of divinely underwritten sufficiency, that second last line on the screen. It says that the birds of the air, the story of the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. The birds managed to be fed. The lilies managed to be dressed in glory. And how much more valuable are we, says Jesus in the parable, to God than the birds and the lilies? And the story Jesus is telling is of divinely underwritten sufficiency. God promising, declaring and ensuring that there will always be enough, always be enough, always be enough. The whole thing, says Ched, representing a catechism in the cosmology of grace, a teaching, a learning to live by a worldview with grace at its centre. Now, who studied economics here? I haven't studied economics, but how many? Some of you have, yes? One, sort of. Come on, only one? Yeah, you think you're about to be tested, so you're not wanting to put your hand up high. You're not going to be tested. You can take me to task afterwards. But my understanding of the basic premise at the heart of most study of economics is it starts with a single problem. There is not enough of everything we want. And so we need a system whereby we can distribute or earn or kind of look after the stuff so that some people can get what they want. Or all, maybe in some systems. But it starts with a single idea: scarcity. What do we do with the problem of scarcity? There's not enough for everyone, therefore we have to figure out a way that it gets managed. And some systems are about everybody, and some are about, well, whoever can afford it. Whoever happens to be able to procure it. That basic premise is at the base of every human economic system devised, but it's not the basic premise of God's economic system. And Ched refers to that, thanks Luke, as Sabbath economics. It's a little book he wrote, The Biblical Vision of Sabbath Economics, a different economic system where God has been, throughout the biblical story, trying to help the creation understand that there is enough for everyone, particularly when there's too much for no one. That there is enough for everyone and too much for no one is the founding principle of God's economic system, the way Ched refers to it and has taken off a bit. Sabbath economics. We are not what we own, says the biblical story. We are children of the living God, and our inheritance from the living God is daily bread. The story of the Israelites leaving captivity and slavery behind, 40 years wandering the desert. You guys know enough geography to know it's pretty insane that people could spend 40 years wandering that geographical distance, right? Yeah? It's pretty insane. But the idea has been that they had to learn a different economic way of being. They'd been in slavery. How did slavery begin? It began because Joseph had a dream and said to Pharaoh, there's a famine coming. It's time to start hoarding. And so the biblical scholars tell us that's the first idea. The first time the idea of scarcity is introduced to the whole biblical narrative. The beginning of Genesis onwards is all the creation is good and there is enough for everybody. And then comes the idea, but soon there won't be enough for everybody, so you better start hoarding. And Egypt starts preparing for the famine. You think, oh, that's good and responsible stuff. Except, as we know, the Israelites start coming in off the farming lands because the famine hits and they come to the cities and they end up enslaved in a system because there's not enough food to go around. It's been hoarded, it's been centralized, it's been kept. There's not enough for everyone. We will manage it. They end up in slavery, and then eventually, generations later, Moses leads the people out into the wilderness and God feeds them with manna, daily bread. And the lesson of the manna, if you remember the story, is that it appears in the morning and the Israelites are invited to collect what they need for the day. And what happens if they try to take too much? It goes bad. It's not available for tomorrow. It's just available today because there's enough today. That's the lesson at the heart of a biblical understanding of economics, that there is enough, especially when we don't hoard, when we don't try to take too much, where we stop trying to worry about tomorrow rather than allowing God to give us tomorrow as a gift. It's a radical, different way to think about life, the universe, and everything. And doesn't it, at some level, feel fanciful? Don't we hear it and go, yeah, but? Isn't your own heart, mind, and spirit sitting in this space doing, yeah, that's nice, but? Aren't you? And that's okay. Let's acknowledge that's why we gather here. That's one of the reasons why we gather here as a community together around this story, is to challenge some of those notions that we have bought into all around us. This economic model that we live with on a daily basis has its claws in us. Its anxieties have been planted deep within us. The idea that we can trust God enough to provide for tomorrow sounds like a Sunday school story. But at the root, if nobody is taking more than they need, there is enough for everybody. We're invited to come together and remind each other of that, and to coach each other and challenge and encourage each other that that's a different way of being, and it will be at the heart of the way we organise life. It's all through the biblical story, not just the manna in the desert. The gift and practice of the Sabbath. Stop producing, stop accumulating once a week is a practice of a different kind than the economics of the world around us. The practice of Jubilee, of every 50 years, slaves go free, debtors are forgiven, debts are forgiven. This is the grace at the heart of Jesus' proclamation when he says, I proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And every time we gather around the table, we're saying, everybody is welcome here. There is enough for everybody. There's enough grace, enough love, enough inclusion for everybody here. This is what we practice when we gather. So how do we guard against, thanks Luke, every form of greed? We gather. We practice the disciplines. We're generous with one another. And we discover that in generosity, when we stop trying to hold on to everything that we have and accumulating more to secure our own future, we actually discover a different way of being when we let go, when we open our hands, when we share with our sisters and brothers. We discover a way of life that is so much more rich and full than the one when we're trying to accumulate for ourselves. We voluntarily redistribute our resources. Absolutely. We voluntarily say, this belongs to all people, not just me. And we trust. We place faith and trust in God. That's the opposite of idolatry. That's the point. We work to release people from economic captivity and slavery with all the strength that's within us. We look at the system that we're a part of and we work to redeem it in the likeness instead of God's kingdom. But more than anything else, we guard against the idolatry of greed by placing our trust and confidence in the only one who is truly worthy of that trust and confidence, our God in Christ. And whenever we do, we hear God over and over again promising there is enough for you. There is enough for each one of you. There's enough love, enough grace. As we say at the confession, there is more grace in God than there is sin in us. This is the whole story. There's more than enough for everything that we need. We just have to stop trying to grab hold of more than we need.